Herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, zu unserer heutigen Präsentation aus der Reihe In the Nature of Materials. Da der heutige Vortrag auf Englisch stattfindet, würde ich jetzt auch gleich in Englisch fortfahren. So, dear students, dear colleagues, dear guests, a really warm welcome to our third talk in this semesters of the series In the Nature of Materials, which is a series that looks at the material properties, at sustainability and innovative aspects related to sustainability in design. And so my name is Jörg Obergfell. I am a professor for interdisciplinary fine arts at the Design Campus in Trier. And tonight I have the honor to welcome Jane Brucker and Dr. Jeremy Wasser. Good morning to Los Angeles. I'm really glad that you can join us tonight. I want to start with some organizational notes. So Jane and Jeremy will give a presentation together, so they will present some slides and also go into a dialogue with each other. And during the talk, you're welcome to drop some notes or questions in the chat that we will address later after the presentation. So there will be enough time for discussion and question. I just want to let you know that this talk will be recorded. So if you don't wish to appear in the video, you can still drop some questions in the chat as mentioned before. Okay, so now a few words on Jane and Jeremy. Jane Brucker is a visual artist currently and educator, currently living in and working in Los Angeles. She studied also in Los Angeles, in California at the San Diego State University, where she received her BA in arts. That was in 1982. Then in 1985, she completed her MFA in painting and performance art at the Claremont Graduate University in California. And then in 1992, she completed another BA in religion and the arts at Claremont School of Theology. As an artist, she had many scholarships and artists in residency, of which I just want to name a few. So for example, at 1987, she received a scholarship for the Skowhegan School of Sculpture and Painting, which is quite a prestigious summer school. And there she was able to study with the famous minimalist painter Agnes Martin. From 1999 to 2000, she had a scholarship for the Educational Alliance in New York, so worked there for 1 year. And she also had the chance to stay in Germany for an artist in residency. Here she was at Schloss Blüchow, also im Mecklenburgischen Künstlerhaus in Mecklenburg. Also, she had a residency with a really interesting title, Darkness and Isolation, at the Scottish Sculpture Workshop in Aberdeenshire in Scotland. She also completed some commissions, for example, for the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, for the United States Senate in Boston, Massachusetts, difficult names, which she completed in 2019. And the title of that work was A Seat at the Table. She held also many solo and group exhibitions internationally. Just to name a few, for example, 2018, Fragile Thoughts at the Long Beach Museum of Art in Long Beach, California. Then 1985, Boulders and Balance, Orlando Gallery, Los Angeles. or in 2014, a show called Peace, Peace, Port in Gallery T, Osaka in Japan. Also currently she's teaching at the Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where she's a professor for drawing and is the head of the fine arts department. So now a few words about Jeremy Wasser. Jeremy completed his BA in biology and geology in Oberlin College, Ohio in 1976. Then he completed a master's in science in zoology at the University of Florida in 1979. And he received his PhD in physiology from the Indiana University in Bloomington in 1985. Currently, he's associate professor at the Department of Medical Physiology at the College of Medicine of the Texas A&M University. And yeah, he had also many lectures and teaching commissions and so on. Among others, he also visited Germany for that. So from 1991 in 1992, he was a visiting scientist at the, I will just say it in German, die Abteilung für Physiologie des Max-Planck-Institut für experimentelle Medizin in Göttingen. And he also was visiting professor at the Tierärztliche Hochschule in Hannover, where he stayed from 2009 to 2010. And yeah, among all these activities, Jane and Jeremy also run an exhibition space in Bonn called Gallery Pluto, where they try to bring together scientists, artists, musicians, writers, and so on. And they focus not only on showing pieces of art or performing some music, but also on the discussion about the pieces that are shown in that space. So quite a special exhibition format. And that's where I also happened to meet them in Bonn, because Jane and Jeremy were also teaching at the International AIB, Institute of International Education in Bonn, where they run courses for American students who visit Germany. I'm sure they will talk a little bit about that. And there they were running also the courses Art and Ecology, where I also had some consignments. So that's how we met. Okay, so I guess tonight Jane and Jeremy want to talk about materials and material choices, and they will show how their lives and professional careers were shaped by those. And by unraveling their own material history, I think they will invite us to reflect our own stories connected to objects, materials, and the environment. So now, and yeah, in that sense, the title of the presentation of Jane and Jeremy is Only What We Love, Understanding Materials as Shared Narrative. Yeah, and with that, I like to hand it over to you, Jane and Jeremy, and yeah, welcome again. I'm really happy that you give us this presentation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg. Yep. So we're really happy to be here. I'm going to share the presentation now.
Yep.
Okay. You should be seeing our screen. As Jörg said, the title of our talk is Only What We Love, Understanding Materials as a Shared Narrative.
Both of our presentations, this entire presentation, is structured around the concepts in this quote from Baba Dioum, who is a Senegalese forestry engineer and conservationist. And he wrote way back in 1968, I think for a UN document, in the end, we will conserve only what we love, we will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught.
So we want to address tonight the question of what is a shared narrative, what is a shared story, and what part do materials play in creating one, as Jörg mentioned. And in order to answer this question, we want to share our stories with you today too. So I'm going to go first. I started out maybe like some of you, like most art, design, architecture students, trying to master some basic concepts and some basic materials and explore techniques at the same time, mostly to achieve my own express my ideas in visual form. And while concept was always a really driving and poetic force for me, I found that materials themselves always interested me, especially the recipes for things like how to make your own oil pastels or learning fresco painting. When I was in Skowhegan, the school that Jörg mentioned, I studied with the apprentices, not only with Agnes Martin, but with the apprentices of Diego Rivera, Lucien Bloch, who taught to me this ancient art of fresco. But I also learned sometimes the hard way, and you can see me here in this rather messy studio with quite a smock full of paint marks, that toxic materials, both toxic to me and toxic to the environment, were overwhelmingly present in the art studio setting. And often, at least at the time when I was in school, we had little guidance to their safe use. To understand my story a little bit further, I want to share with you, or it might be helpful to know, that in the 1970s and 80s, when I was growing up, say from maybe the age of 10, even into my 30s, I spent each summer at my older brother's Northern California homestead. First, he lived in a teepee, then a reconstructed wood post cabin with a kitchen yurt, then a home fully hydroelectric and solar powered, where every part was hand built. He made it himself: stairs, furniture, doors, cabinets, the barn. Here you see my sister-in-law, who was an environmental activist and very vocal in the California movement to save the redwoods. Here she is standing when she was young in front of a felled redwood trunk. From this experience, I learned about things like organic gardens, compost toilets, water scarcity, reforesting practice, and making homemade salsas. I learned to be concerned about the earth and to approach every item with care and an awareness of its history and impact on the planet. But you can see from this image here, this experience I had at my brother's was in dramatic contrast to the sprawling Southern California suburbia and the male-dominated car culture and art world that I returned to each fall. As a result, I struggled with finding my place as a young female artist in Los Angeles, whose concern for the planet and deep spiritual need to care for others was out of step with the trend. In this picture, you see the LA freeway, typical in the 90s, on your right, and three of the art guys that made the LA art scene a real scene: Ed Ruscha, Joe Good, and Jerry McMillan, way back in 1970. So I did not see the solution, though, as confining my practice to natural materials. I didn't want to make art that was just working with sticks, and I wasn't sure I wanted to continue with traditional art supplies either. They were just too toxic. So the answer, interestingly, led me back to my own family history. Let me tell you a little bit more. My grandmother built her house in 1926 in San Diego, which was my hometown along the Mexico border. And it looked like this. This is 1930, actually. The image on the left was what her street looked like, and her house, sort of Spanish Revival, California style bungalow architecture. And until a few years ago, the house that you see here was still in my family. Perhaps that kind of family longevity and continuity of place is typical for many of you. For Europeans, I think it's more common, but it's really not very common in California. And in just 60 years later, in 1995, when my grandparents died, you can see what San Diego neighborhoods looked like. The picture on the right, quite a contrast. So when my grandmother, who you see here in the image on the left, built her house, she was a single mother. And she was also living then only a few years later through the 1929 depression. And during that time, she learned to save everything. Everything was precious. Everything could be used again. Matchbooks, photographs. I have clippings, fabric, chipped ceramics, clothing, knickknacks, buttons. I collected a whole treasure trove of items that she collected. Her collection was meant almost like a museum for ordinary everyday people. And when she died, I inherited her treasure trove of objects. And those many small objects became a reference point for all of my aesthetic decisions from that point on. So the image that you see on the right is one of my pieces called Building Book. This was when my grandmother remarried. My grandfather did a lot of building and rebuilding around our house, or her house. And I inherited this book from him, which was very well worn. And I took apart one of her pearl necklaces to make this simple grid binding around this book. So I organized these materials that I received from her. I began to see my own history, or the history of others in them. I started making works that would use these materials to shape a story, or a fragment of a story to present not just the past, but the current moment, or in some cases, a cautionary future tale. Here was her bank book that she kept meticulous track of her money in, and I cast it in brass along with her pencil. She had the same pencil she used all the time I knew her. And then you see an excerpt or a little detail from my piece Lost, which looks like this. This is a large 8-foot square table. It's now even larger than this with even more objects, all cast in brass and bronze. I made this piece called Lost because I felt things fall apart. We lose buttons, keys, money, we lose relationships. We misplace papers and information. I spend hours searching for a particular letter, or there are treasures in the bottom of a drawer or in the back of a closet that have been misplaced or forgotten. All around us, we witness loss every day. We experience loss daily, from small things like our keys to larger things like our family members or our friends. I thought the recurring experience of loss throughout our lives can be seen as a kind of practice for the inevitable loss of our bodies when we die. Using castings of these small, discarded everyday objects and casting them in precious metals, I created this project to make a connection between the artist's aesthetic practice and the cycle of life. You see actually my grandmother's small coin purse in the image on your left. Each component acts as a visual notation and as part of a complex fragmentary narrative. When I cast these objects, some of them were broken or broke during the casting process, and that was part of it too. Here you see some chess pieces and a small little device that's meant for cutting thread. These tiny cast metal remembrances are reminders that objects carry a special part of the past and that can't really be found in just a written record. They allow us to see the past not through the writings of people who have a particular viewpoint. These objects are things that we share, and communicating through them makes a kind of shared narrative. Often I have people, when they look at my pieces, remember things, or the objects remind them of something maybe their grandmother had. This was my grandmother's makeup. And I actually took the makeup out before casting and replaced it back into the little container that it came in. So these objects connect us in a broad and more general way too, to culture and to time. Sometimes I feel drawn to tell someone else's story. This piece is an extension of the project Lost, but it started with this woman that you see here on your right, because this is my friend Dina's grandmother. Her name is was Cordelia Story, and she was born in 1896. She toured as an opera singer and performed across America as a member of the Los Angeles Opera Company from 1913 through the 1940s. She designed and created most of the clothing worn in her performances, as you can see here, and the wonderful crown on the left, which if you look closely, you can see all of her hand stitching. When she died, Dina gave me her sewing box. This was the sewing box that she had used to make her costumes, and that was filled with notions and added embellishments, little bits of lace, little safety pins and zippers. Her little, you can see in the bottom there, her push pin, her little pin cushion where she would keep her needles. And she would use this box to decorate her own everyday clothing throughout her life. Here's another close-up. And a beautiful lace collar, all cast in brass. So telling and performing stories through materials has always been a part of my work. My piece, Unravel, engages others in reflection and creates a meditative mindset as I ask participants to take apart or re-knit a handmade garment. Hand-knit blankets, sweaters, shawls, and vests are all taken apart and then recreated or just left to fly apart on their own in a process that mirrors this compromise and change in our lives, this sense of needing to constantly let go. It's a piece about materials, touching the materials, handling the materials, feeling the yarn, whether it's wool or cotton, finding the stitch, finding the thread, all able to pull those threads easily without any tools, without making a cut or using a pair of scissors. This performance and these collaborative pieces that are the result of these performative experiences center on this contemplative aspect of letting go, of the nature of doing, undoing, and redoing. Here's an image or two images from these performances. What interests me is the way in which when we take something apart, it allows us to sort of change our mind, to start over. A shawl or a scarf becomes a hat or just simply a knitted item. The process is evident in the installations that incorporate these reworked and reconstructed pieces, and the participants help me to create them. I also continue with the solo performances and participatory performances, where I use a very gentle touch and the principles of the Alexander technique with me as the teacher to guide the participant. That's what you see in the image on the left here. In the Alexander technique, if you're not familiar with that, it's just the idea that we could have more ease at any moment by just noticing the tension in our bodies and letting it go. Often we work with the neck as a source of tension that sometimes translates throughout the whole body. And so many of these performances involve me gently touching or guiding a person into a more peaceful state. When the participants are engaged in this process, it helps them to recognize these tension patterns in their own bodies, and often helps them to realize that these tension patterns can be the result of physical habit. And in the process of unraveling, they begin to learn themselves how to generate this feeling of ease. In the performance on your left, that's actually a virtual performance made with my colleague, Naho Kawabe, who is a Japanese artist who lives in Hamburg. And she paired various artists throughout the globe with each other. And here I spent half an hour with my partner, who was in Berlin, I believe at the time, and we were each engaged in our process of making, or in my case, unmaking, in this sort of magical underwater room that Naho had created. It's part of her response to the pandemic, really. And in the piece on the right, you see just a student from Texas A&M University engaged in the unravel performance. Here's what the images or the unravel piece looks like, or a sample of what it can look like when it's installed in a space. It retains that quiet, meditative atmosphere even after the participants have left. And sometimes the participants are part of a performance that's witnessed by the audience. In the gallery that I'm represented by in Los Angeles, Bake Art, we see a performance here in their wonderful space that involved a very high window and opening where two vocalists were actually making sounds or singing as the performers undid these various garments and materials. This work has kinetic components. The upper teeth move. It's called ironing things out. And I created molds from my father's teeth that were cast in bronze and combined them with my great-grandmother's ironing board. The work alludes to the responsibilities that one should complete before dying and is an opportunity to reflect on death. I actually made this piece, I was making this piece after my father died and my mother was left alone. I didn't know these were my father's teeth at first, and it changed these materials, and the fact that those were the teeth that I was actually using for this casting changed this piece completely. I had another piece in mind, and I asked my mother, who had had a lot of dental work, if she had any plaster teeth laying around I could use for the mold. And she gave me a whole bag of them and said, here, take some of these. I didn't know, I assumed they were all hers. And I didn't know it until I was actually cleaning the cast after the piece, that indeed these were my father's teeth from a dental cast, because he had a little space between his teeth. And I could see that as I was cleaning the casting. And so to reflect back on the moment my father sat down on the couch with me and said, look, I'm dying. Here's what I want you to do. Here's what I need to take care of. The piece became about this. My mother actually had to give up her ironing board because she was still using this ironing board to that day. Another piece that began with my father's death was this piece, Memorial Project. It began in 2001, actually a little sooner than that even. My dad was a very snappy dresser. He didn't have very many things, and he was a very well-known educator and very beloved. When he died, my mother didn't have very many of his things except for his clothes, which were still hanging in the closet. She felt like she needed to clean out the closet, and yet what do? She didn't want to give them away. My brothers certainly weren't going to wear those shirts. So I said, I'll make you a piece, Mom. I'll make you a small canvas. So I took this small canvas, 7 by 9 inches, and I stretched one of my father's favorite shirts over it, just as a private remembrance for my mother. When my mother's friends visited the house and saw that, they of course recognized the shirt as belonging to my father. And later, each of those visitors asked my mother if they could also donate an article of clothing and if I would make them the same small canvas memorial. The people who contributed to that this project often tell me that they enjoy the idea that their own memorial piece is now presented in the harmony with others. So maybe with one shirt, I might make 4 pieces. The person who donated the article of clothing might want that piece, a piece to remember someone by, but they might leave 3 or 2 or even 1 other piece, or even all of the pieces with me. And now this piece numbers over 300, actually almost 400 pieces. So they enjoy seeing it together. And even if you don't have a piece as part of this work, you imagine the stories because you relate to these items. It just creates like a chorus of memories. And this was a performance that I did in front of one of the pieces in Los Angeles with a Los Angeles choreographer, Scott Heinzerling. It was called Memorial Duet. I recently took some of those stories and instead of performing them, began to create a page on my website where those stories could be recorded, where someone could tell me that story and of the person who wore the shirt or the garment. And here's 3 of the stories you can find on my website now. I've just started this part of the project. This was an interesting piece that was donated to me for Memorial Project, and it's now a piece called Mend, and then it has a partner piece called Mint Condition, which I'll show you in a minute. When I received this piece, I was just so full of stains and stitching that I just couldn't cut it up. It reminded me of American anthropologist James Dietz, who in his book, In Small Things Forgotten, pioneered ideas of using neglected substances such as trash pits, pot shards, and soil stains to reveal human actions. In an ethic of care, material choices are intentional, even if they are also intuitive. I just couldn't let this dress go. And I realized that objects like this, when they have this worn patina, tell a better story over time. Additionally, gathering and playing with materials that come to me affects the outcome of the work and how I understand the meaning and the story. So the stains and the mends that you see here were just presented or represented to you as the dress hung on this hanger in the gallery. But I couldn't just show it alone. That didn't seem like doing it justice enough or telling the story fully enough. I wanted that sense of how we're born and how we travel through life and the way in which we repair and mend and try to treasure even these frayed elements or these sewn up small parts of an object. And so I took the dress, I made patterns of it, and I reproduced it perfectly in very starched muslin. And when I got to the buttons, I was a little perplexed because they were very unusual buttons with a very rounded sort of top to them. And I was never going to find perfect new buttons that looked like that. So what I did was I took the buttons off, I removed them, and there's quite a few buttons, as you can see, on the collars and the pockets. I took those off and I made a cast of them. And for the pink dress, the worn dress, I cast those buttons using a very simple casting material, wood glue. And when it dried, it was very yellow and sort of old looking, almost like, I don't know, it looked like old fingernails or something to me. It's a little translucent. And then I took white glue and cast the buttons again for the new dress. So mint condition is the way we come into the world. It's actually also a reference to what we talk about when we talk about a really perfect car. It's in mint condition. And then mend is the contrast to that piece. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about my materials because just a little glimpse into what my studio looks like. That dress was tucked away in my studio for many years, as are many other small and sometimes larger now objects. Collecting objects that were owned by others or that come from your own family as heirlooms is very different than other type of collecting. There's often a deep sentimental value attached to items, sometimes items others would consider rather worthless. But because those items have been passed down from one generation to the next, they really have something special to them, and I enjoy working with them and handling them with care. I have them all organized. So what you see here is a view into each box, of which I have maybe 100 boxes in my studio. And they're all categorized, listed, stacked, piled up carefully together. And I work with them as if I were an archaeologist or a librarian or an archivist. And it's extremely satisfying to me. Maybe there is just some element of care in that alone. Using these kinds of materials carefully was a part of this piece. I made it in 2005 when my mother was diagnosed with a very disfiguring form of cancer. She had always been very happy about her looks and always had even cared for herself so perfectly during her illness that sometimes the doctors didn't realize she was in a lot of pain. So to honor her life history, rather than her changing looks that would have been reflected in the glass in her dressing mirrors, I created a set of hand mirrors that replaced that looking glass with polished wood that showed the age of the trees through its notated rings, burls, and marks. Here's a detail, you can see the wood up close. 10 years before that, I had created another pair of mirrors. These reflected my own image, my own identity, questioning my experience of faith and femininity using maiden, M-A-I-D-E-N, and maiden, M-A-D-E-I-N, as in made in the image of God. Maiden, M-A-I-D-E-N, as in a maid. These two mirrors were part of my master's study in religion at the Claremont Graduate School of Theology, and they reflected some of my research on the story of Hagar from the Abraham narrative, which is part of the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. In this narrative, God isn't a very nice deity and isn't really very helpful to Hagar as she tries to find her identity, and instead is sent back to become a handmaiden to Sarah. I've done a lot of work with mirrors, and this is another example. These are some small compacts that were also given to me by a special person. Mostly I love to explore things like this when I get them, and I gather these new or unconsidered materials because there's always stories that I can tell with them. These compacts represent just another way in which material can hold meaning and value, because not only are they reflective, but they also, the way we use them is part of the story. This sort of intimate communication, either between yourself, you and yourself, as you would look into a compact to fix your hair or put on your lipstick, or between oneself and other people, just like speech, touch, or gesture. This project is called Fragile Thoughts. And what you're looking at here on the left is a small detail of the parlor type chair that you see off in the distance in the image on the right. The chair features a hand-drawn portrait of Elizabeth Milbank Anderson, and it has been fused onto a glass oval. The glass portrait creates a kind of necklace or a medallion as it hangs from the back of the chair, and I used hand-dyed vintage ribbon to make this. I created it for the Long Beach Museum of Art in my installation titled Fragile Thoughts, and it was a tribute to Anderson because she was an early 20th century philanthropist who championed healthcare, education, women's issues, and the arts, and whose summer house, which was built in 1912, similar in time to my grandmother's house, still stands as part of the Long Beach Museum campus. In this piece, I particularly focused on Elizabeth Milbank Anderson's healthcare legacy. I made multiple glass elements using various techniques, from traditional painted or leaded glass to fused glass, and choosing just the right materials really meant that I needed to have a deeper understanding than I already had of glass and its traditions. I had been blowing glass and slumping glass, but I'd never worked in stained glass or fusing. Judson Studios is one of the oldest family-run stained glass studios in the US, and they helped me to understand this process better. I feel glass is an inherently beautiful and fragile material, so it works really well to reflect my ongoing interest in just portraying the fragility of life and loss. So each of these glass elements were embedded into an antique chair. Each chair depicts a part of Elizabeth Milbank Anderson's life, and there are 7 chairs altogether. in these chairs, there's actually 2 of them, and they're identical. These were actually chairs from my grandparents' dining room set. Each one depicts a child standing in an image I received from the Library of Congress on Elizabeth Milbank Anderson's public baths. These public baths were built in 1904 by Anderson, and they provided individual warm water bathing to replace the unsanitary floating baths that were used by residents of New York's overcrowded cold water tenements. So Milbank Anderson understood that environmental factors were a prime cause of illness, and which in turn, illness was a prime cause of poverty, and still is, particularly in America. So these 2 girls were across from each other. Each was hand-drawn and then painted onto this rare red flash glass, where the red glass layer was partially removed and revealing a kind of clear glass layer underneath. And then the girls would be painted with vitreous paint on top of that. Here's the image from the Library of Congress. And so if you look at the small girl about 4 back on the left-hand side, you can see it's this girl in the plaid dress that I just showed you. And the girl in white is the front one on the right. Using these materials in the Judson studios was amazing. Here I am making the next chair that I'm showing you with one of Judson's really amazing craftspersons, Martine, and we're in their historical building where I was able to choose glass from their historical collection. And they often will take or recycle glass from other buildings or other objects and just have it there to use again. I made this chair. So this is the chair on the left that you just saw me working on with Martine. And it represented a more traditional take on leaded stained glass materials. And those were inset into the back of this chair as an architectural, making the chair almost like an architectural element with an empty seat that for me evoked a sense of charity and became a reference to the church window or a church where we often see stained glass as a place of refuge. Judson is doing some amazing things now, and they recently had a retrospective. They're the largest stained glass studio in the United States, and their exhibition From Gothic to Street Style featured my chairs because I'm a more contemporary artist working with them. Many contemporary artists that are working with them now, but they also, the show also went all the way back to their early history. So one of my last images that I'll share with you tells the story of Elizabeth Milbank Anderson's dedication to providing healthcare to those with tuberculosis, and for her support in eradicating the horrible disease of diphtheria. She actually had a child who died of diphtheria, and diphtheria was characterized as the strangling angel of children. They really suffered horribly in this death in the early 20th century. And she was very devoted to eradicating it during her lifetime, which she did. And you see here these petri dishes where we duplicated diseases in these fused glass elements, sort of mimicking the diseases. The last image I'll show then is a piece, an older piece for me called Spiritual Medicine. And I think it's a good transition back to our theme for today and also to Dr. Wasser's talk. These little pills really were about, I made these in probably the early 90s, just as a way of handing out this idea of taking our medicine spiritually, that's sort of part of healing and health. And I love that the jar on the right is full of love pills, which is sort of our theme for today. So I'm going to invite Jeremy to come back. Because in the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught.
Thank you, Jane. We're going to switch seats. So I'm back in the center seat here at our console. Jane's narrative began in California, and through her work on Elizabeth Milbank Anderson and Elizabeth Milbank Anderson's work in New York City in the early part of the 20th century, ended in New York. And the narrative that I'm going to share with you starts in New York and ends in California. So that is also an example of an intersection of narratives, the intersection of Jane's and mine. And then at the very end of our talk, we'll be together and talk about another sort of commingling and coming together of these narratives. Unlike Jane, who was born and raised in California, I was born in New York, excuse me, in the Bronx, which is the northernmost of the 5 boroughs of the Bronx. I think when most people who are not New Yorkers think of New York, they're thinking Manhattan. But in fact, there's a whole bunch of other things that are New York. And I lived in the Bronx. And at that time, I was born in 1955, and in the 50s and 60s, there were large sections of the Bronx that were in terrible disarray. They were ghettos. And buildings were burned out and destroyed, and there were rubble-strewn lots, and the people there were very, very poor. And it was actually, especially the 60s, a time of great social upheaval in New York, particularly in the Bronx. I didn't live in the South Bronx, which is the picture on the left here, which is where these ghettos were mostly located. I lived in the north and western part of the borough, and there were buildings like the one on the right, which is an example of what we called at that time a lower middle income housing project. And these were buildings that were made about 7 stories high. They were brick buildings, apartment buildings, and there would be many of them in one clump. So they were a sort of a clump of these buildings, and they were funded in part by government support. They were federally financed housing for people of relatively modest means. And so that was the sort of building in which I lived from the time I was born and brought home from the hospital, Bronx Hospital, as it happens, by my parents, until I was about 9 years old or so. And the environment was a very urban one, as you can see from these pictures. And I would say that the materials of my youth, of my early years, were pretty much concrete, brick, asphalt, and steel. And what I'm going to tell you in this personal narrative is the transition for me from an urban animal and one for whom the materials were these ones that I just listed, to really a Naturmensch, someone who was interested and fascinated by the natural world and natural materials, and who ultimately became a biologist, which is what I am. I'm a professor of physiology, but I trained in zoology, and I'm basically a biologist. Now, this is a picture of the playgrounds associated with those housing projects. We had playgrounds, and we'd play in them, but they are not like the Kinderspielplätze that you see in Germany that have grass or have wooden chips and are kind of built into a quasi-natural environment in many instances. This is a playground it was a concrete playground. And in fact, even the basketball courts that we had available at that time did not have as the material for the nets of the basketball hoop. They didn't have cord nets. They either had no nets at all and you just had the iron rim, or they had a net made out of iron mesh, out of steel mesh. So that was the environment and the materials of my youth. But curiously, I began at a very young age to sort of deviate from that world of materials and enter another one. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. If I can get this thing to advance. Second, there we go. When I was very young, before I went to kindergarten, before I was in school, I would wake up in the morning on Saturday when my parents were sleeping in, and I would turn on the television. I wanted to watch cartoons. But it was like 5 or 5:30 in the morning, and there were no cartoons on at that time, at that hour. The only thing on TV then, and we didn't have a million channels, of course, and we didn't have Netflix or anything like that, or cable. The only thing on at that time were public service documentaries, films, made by the US Department of Agriculture and designed for the continuing education of farmers. And the one that I watched in my New York City apartment when I was a child was a show called The Modern Farmer. This is a similar one, another show from the 1950s called The American Farmer. And as I said, these were designed to inform and train farmers in the use of equipment like tractors and combines and so on. And so we'll play about a 10-second clip from this to give you an idea of what I was watching when I was probably 5 on Saturday morning.
Mr. Blasey was always learning new things himself. He said a farmer had to stay in business. Why, he knew as much about biology and botany and chemistry as most school teachers.
All right. So I would watch these shows, and then by the time my parents woke up, I was watching cartoons, because that would be a little bit later in the morning, and the cartoons came back on. So my parents had no idea that I was watching The Modern Farmer, and I was, as it turned out, incorporating some of these ideas and thoughts into my being. But in the summers, my parents would also go up to the Catskills, which is a region of hills, and we call them mountains, but it's a Hügellandschaft, north of New York, about 150 kilometers north of New York City, and we'd stay there for parts of the summer to get out of the city. And I'll come back and talk a bit more about the Catskills in another couple of slides. But we had an experience once there. We were driving around, and I was sitting in the back of our 1950 Ford car, and we drove past a field of Holstein cattle, of cows, and I announced to my parents, those cows' udders are full. The farmer needs to get out there and milk those cows. And my mother turns around from the front seat and says, where the hell did you learn that? Literally, that's how she spoke. And I said, well, I get up early in the morning on Saturday and I watch this show called The Modern Farmer. This marked that beginning of this transformation in the kind of materials I was going to ultimately work with. I didn't become a farmer, obviously, but the kind of materials I was ultimately going to work with in my adult life. I was also fortunate in growing up in New York, because even though it is a huge megalopolis and urban place, and has the materials and the architecture and structure of a giant city, it also has a lot of culture and a lot of other opportunities for people to see nature. The picture on the left is the Children's Zoo at the Bronx Zoo, the New York Zoological Park, which is one of the world's greatest zoos. And there was a children's zoo there that allowed kids to get up and close to mostly domestic animals, but also other animals. And then the picture on the right is from the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Again, one of the world's great natural history museums, very much like the Naturalistisches Museum in Vienna or the one in Berlin. I was taken there in my stroller by my parents, who were also interested in these kinds of things. And I've probably been there literally thousands of times throughout my childhood and adolescence, and even today when I go back to New York. So I had an opportunity to see things outside of that concrete jungle environment, and it began to germinate within me in terms of the kinds of things that I was going to ultimately love and want to understand, and why I became the academic that I ultimately became. The other really dramatic thing that I remember from my early youth in the American Museum of Natural History was the Hall of Oceans, which is there to this day. It's been renovated, but it's still there. And in it, after 1968, when it was first installed, was this 94-foot fiberglass model of a blue whale. And this thing loomed over you as you entered into this kind of blue environment that made you think you were in the ocean and underwater. And it was staggering because, these are not the kind of animals we saw in the Bronx out and about. We saw pigeons, we saw squirrels, we saw rats, but we did not see marine mammals, and we didn't really have an appreciation of them. And yet there was this opportunity to go and see them, and they were quite amazing. And in fact, to this day, I find myself teaching. I teach physiology, both to my own students who are life science students that they're planning on being doctors, most of them, but also when I teach Jane's students at Loyola Marymount, who are art students and other kinds of students, I teach a lot about marine mammals, and I teach a lot about diving physiology and how these animals are able to dive to the depths that they can and hold their breaths for hours on end, and what's going on in their bodies, in their architecture, their personal architecture, the architecture of the body, when they make these deep dives. And when I give these lectures and when I prepare this material, I am thinking about that fiberglass whale in the American Museum, which I saw again when I was quite young and which made a very big impact on me. Another piece of New York, which is an unusual piece, but which was very, very important in my personal development, were the parks. And in fact, the motto of the Bronx is the borough of parks and universities. And my mother always reminded me of that. And I lived quite close to one in that housing project. And that was Bronx Park, which is pictured here. And there's a river runs through it called the Bronx River. It was back then, and probably to this day is quite polluted, but it's also quite lovely in its way. And it's within blocks of major streets with major traffic that you can hear from within this natural environment. The picture on the right is also the Bronx Park. There's a little tiny waterfall, and I actually played in that river and floated myself over that waterfall as part of what I was doing and enjoying the river. I shudder a little bit to think about that now, because it really was probably, it was not a clean environment, but I wasn't worried about that so much back then. Point I'm making is that even though I lived in that concrete jungle, there were avenues out into nature that one could take advantage of. And the curious thing is that in a urban environment, if there are green spaces, the nature gets concentrated. Out in the rest of the United States and out in the hinterlands in Germany and other countries, there's a lot of nature, but it covers a lot of land. In New York, in Manhattan, you have Central Park. In the Bronx, you have Bronx Park and Pelham Bay Park, and then you have a lot of concrete. So the animals and plants are concentrated in these relict ecosystems. And it turns out there's a remarkable amount of biodiversity in these small pockets of nature, of the kind of environment that used to cover all of New York back when the only people who lived there were the indigenous Amerindians of the East Coast of North America. So among the things that I got interested in, well, before I talk about that, I also went off to summer camp, again, in the Catskills. This was a common thing for kids of my generation and socioeconomic class, and particularly the Jewish kids of my neighborhood like me. We got sent off to Jewish kid camp in the summer, I think mostly to get us out of our parents' way, out of our parents' hair for a while. And some of these were day camps where you came back in the evenings, and some of them you stayed over and you were there for weeks and weeks. And then you came back to the city at the end of the summer for school. And you had all kinds of sort of outdoor activities and arts and crafty activities and hiking and learning how to shoot a bow and arrow, which is something, again, that at that time we didn't do much in the Bronx, and also to learn how to swim and to canoe and to enjoy nature. So this is, again, another spot where urban New Yorkers and urban New Yorkers' children got sent to experience nature. And in my case, it contributed to this evolution of what I felt was important and what I wanted to learn about and what I wanted to understand. So I became a bird watcher, and this came about because of a gift of materials. When I was 13, I had the Jewish coming of age ceremony of bar mitzvah, and one of the gifts I received from one of the people who came was a pair of binoculars and a field guide to the birds, a famous one by an ornithologist, an American ornithologist named Roger Tory Peterson. And this was a guide you used to identify all the birds around you. And I got really, really into this and began bird watching every weekend and all the times I could. And I went off to high school. I went to the Bronx High School of Science. This is a photograph, not of me, I'm not in this picture, but of would have been classmates of mine, because I was there from 1972 to 1976. And they have a nice skeleton there, which also will, in a way, come back to be part of the materials and architecture I work with now as a professor of physiology. But I studied biology along with everything else, but I developed an intention at that time to go to college and become an ornithologist, a scientist who studies birds. And my father, and I want to do a shout out to him posthumously, he would get up early in the morning on a Sunday in the middle of the winter in New York when it's quite cold and nasty, and take me out bird watching, take me out to the parks to see birds. And it wasn't really his thing, but he knew it was mine, and he enjoyed being in nature also. And he would do this, and we would go out and we would watch birds. So I went off from this high school to college. I studied, as Professor Obergfell said in the intro, biology and geology. Geology, not because I wanted to be a geologist, but because I took a course and I found it really interesting, and I realized that I wanted to understand it. So it's another example of our leitmotif for this presentation, Jane's and mine together, and that is love and interest are connected, and it's fundamental to if you're going to really want to love and therefore preserve anything, you want to understand it, and understanding is a very, very important component of this. And so my materials then in college, when I was training to be a biologist and also studying geology, became the materials of living things that make them up, and as I said, the architecture of the body, and also the materials of the earth, the stones, the soil, the water, the landforms that I also studied when I was in college. When I would come home in the summers from college, for a couple of years, I had a job at the Bronx Zoo. I went back to the Bronx Zoo, but as a tierpfleger, as a zookeeper. And I was assigned work in the building on the left. This is the Lily Atchison Wallace World of Birds, which was opened in 1972. It was brand new when I started working there. And I also worked in the aquatic birdhouse. And what tierpfleger do most of the time is clean up after the animals. And I spent a lot of time cleaning up after the birds. But I had another experience there, a story I do want to tell you. And that relates to the bird on the right of this slide. Not this individual bird, but this species. That is a concave cast hornbill. And they're quite large. They're probably close to about a meter tall. Excuse me. And as a junior keeper, I would take care of the cages of animals that were not on display. And we had a female concave cast hornbill, like the one shown here. Normally they live on the Indian subcontinent in Southeast Asia in the jungles. And we had one living by herself in a cage, away from the public and away from other hornbills and other birds. And I would clean her cage. Now, I had observed with our other hornbills that they had a little ritual, pairs of them, males and females, had a little ritual where they would pass bits of fruit they usually eat, back and forth to one another with those big beaks on the end of the beak. They would pass fruit back and forth. And it was a pair bond strengthening ritual that these birds engaged in to further the pair bond of mating pairs of these birds. And this lonely female hornbill was sitting there by herself. And I just had the idea one day when I was cleaning her cage to toss her a grate from her food pan. And then I went back to cleaning the cage and didn't think much about it. Well, she caught it. And the next thing I knew, I'm cleaning underneath her perch and I feel this tapping on my head. And I look up and she's holding the grate and sort of moving around like this. So I put my hand out and she dropped it in my hand. And what I realized is that she had fallen in love and thought I was a male hornbill and that she wasn't going to be alone anymore. And so we played around a little bit like that. And then of course I had to go and I guess I broke her bird heart and I feel bad about that. But it was another sort of interesting experience of mine at the Bronx Zoo. The next figure shows you one of the indoor exhibits there. And this is also an example of a coming together of materials from the natural world and from the man-made world. These scarlet ibis are indoors in that Lily Atchison Wallace World of Birds house. And there was no glass or bars in front of the exhibits. The exhibits were designed to mimic an environment that the birds lived in nature and liked. The back wall was painted green. It is concrete. And there was light, there was water, it was warm, and the hallways were designed architecturally to be kind of cold and bleak a bit and dark. And as a consequence of this arrangement, the birds would stay in the exhibit. It was rare. Occasionally a bird would come out of the exhibit. One of my jobs was to chase the bird back into the exhibit. But most of the birds were perfectly happy staying in this artificial environment that emulated their natural environment. And it was, of course, the materials that were used by the designers and the zoo personnel that did this. And of course, the food was in that part of the building and not out in the hallways. So this is something that, again, I will come back to a bit when I talk about some of the work I did actually with Professor Obergfell and also with Jane in a course called Art and Ecology taught at Loyola Marymount, but also in Bonn when those students in Germany, when those students had the opportunity to study abroad. I also worked at the Cornell University Laboratory of Ornithology in Ithaca, New York, and I did a project there with one of their ornithologists on the systematics or taxonomy of yellow-bellied sapsuckers, which is a species of woodpeckers. And these are just figures of bird specimen trays. Most of what goes on in a major museum doesn't take place in the exhibit areas. That's for people to see, and it's important and it's educational, and it creates this love of nature and love of animals that's so important for conservation biology, of course. But the work of the scientists in museums takes place behind the scenes. And in a museum like the ones in Berlin and Vienna and New York, there are hundreds of thousands of these specimens in these drawers. Some of them are 200 years old, these specimens, and they're all labeled. And researchers can go in and study them and learn about biodiversity, changes in numbers of birds of certain species over time, and also about the evolution and systematics of the birds themselves. And I worked on a project like that on these woodpeckers called yellow-bellied sapsuckers. It's a funny name in English, but they do actually make holes in trees, and then they suck the sap. They lick the sap that comes out of those little holes, and that's where they get their name. Moving forward, this interest in living materials, the materials that make up the animals themselves, got manifested in a new way much more recently when I began working with Jane and also with Jörg Obergfell and other colleagues in a course called Art and Ecology. This is a course at Loyola Marymount University, where Jane is a professor of art and art history, and where I'm a scholar in residence at one of the institutes. And the students in it draw. There's another course called Animal Drawing. That's the central panel here, where students are drawing animals. But in the Art and Ecology course, they are exposed to not just the animals, but also the materials that make up the animals. And that's the picture on the right. Those are the hands of our colleague and friend, the artist Glenn Grishkoff, who also teaches in this course. And among the things that he does is he makes brushes out of bird feathers, all different kinds, and also other parts of animals, fur, hair, and so on, and bamboo. And then these are brushes that can be used. So the feathers are molted from the bird, so the bird dies and its feathers become part of this brush. And then they are used to draw birds and other things. So there is a continuity there, a circle there, and a transformation of material from its use in the actual bird, the actual avian architecture, to its use as an artistic material to create art. The other thing that we do in art and ecology, and my contribution is mostly in this arena, is to teach the students about ecology. Now that's a word that everybody knows, and it's a word that people use, that politicians are using a lot now. The COP26 conference in Glasgow just finished. And there's, of course, a lot of concern because of climate change and global warming, which is an existential threat. So we should be concerned. But the vast majority of people, even those who use the word, have never really studied ecology and don't necessarily know what it really means, what an ecosystem is, and how ecosystems are put together by their own materials. And the materials of an ecosystem are living materials, the animals and plants that inhabit that particular habitat, and also the inanimate materials, the physical environment, the water, the air, the clouds, the dirt, the rocks, the soil, and so on. And my contribution to these courses is to teach the students something about that science and how it relates to the animals in it, why it's important, and again, to try and foster a love for the environment, because again, that is the only way we're ever going to really do something about making sure that it is maintained. Because as our quote says, we love what we understand. And in this course, among the things we do with the students when we have them in Bonn, Germany, is we take them to the Museum Alexander Koenisch, which is the Naturalist Museum in Bonn. And like many classic naturalist museums, they have these dioramas, like the one on the right. That's a large display of stuffed animals around a fake waterhole, and is illustrating what you might find around an African waterhole in Africa. And here again, we have some real materials. Those skins are real, but there is no flesh. There are no bones in those specimens. That's not how they're made. They are a simulacrum of the living animal, but they are important in that educational context. And on the right is an example of a project, and I think this is actually one of Jörg Obergfell's projects for his students, in which they were asked to juxtapose nature and artifice. They were supposed to look for situations in the museum that they could photograph that would show the specimen or specimens, but also via reflection, via an odd angle of the camera, show also the fact that these were not animals in nature, but were rather animals or specimens in a artificial environment. It's a very interesting project, and the picture on the left is really almost abstract in its structure and really very cool. But it also, I think, demonstrated an important point to the students about that juxtaposition of the real and the artificial. I also work with my own students in Berlin, and I have the pleasure of working with an urban ecologist and urban beekeeper named Silke Meyer, who shows my students that even in the midst of a city like Berlin, in these pockets of environment, in these pockets of nature, which in Berlin, by that we mean the Tiergarten, of course, the big park, but also the smaller pockets of green in the cemeteries, for example, which is where she has some of her apiaries, some of her beehives. She shows my students what you can do with urban beekeeping. It's something I think that my students find quite surprising. Many of my students from Texas are from rural environments. They're not from New York City as I was. And when they get to Berlin, it's a big city, and they're a little bit shocked because those are not the materials of their lives. That asphalt and steel and the trams going by and the Plattenhäuser and so on. They're not used to that. And for them to be taken back into this microcosm of nature and shown this beekeeping and urban ecological system is really quite, I think, a profound one for them, and teaches them about that juxtaposition that is so important. The other thing I do in all of these courses is that, since I'm a physiologist, I tell my students stories about physiology. And among the ones that I share with them is a story about a giraffe. And there were giraffes in that exhibit at the Museum Alexander König. And here's a real giraffe eating acacia in Africa, which is what they do. And giraffes are very, very large. I'm sure you've seen them in zoos or in documentaries. And a big male giraffe can stand almost 20 feet high, and so almost 6-7 meters high. And the neck is maybe 2 meters long. And this presents some physiological problems for these animals because their heart, which is located in the body of the giraffe, as you would expect, has to pump blood to the brain of this giraffe. And it can do that, but it's pumping against gravity. It has to pump the blood all the way uphill to the brain of the giraffe. And it accomplishes this by being very large and by generating a pressure twice as much as the pressure generated by the hearts of human beings. And it generates this high pressure in what we call the left ventricle, and that drives the blood all the way up to the brain of the giraffe. The other problem giraffes have is that their feet are located a couple of meters below their heart. And if you've ever sat on a plane for a long time or stood at attention for a long time, you know that blood pools in the veins of your legs. And if you get up too quickly, you can actually become, we say, syncopic. You can fall over because of the drop in blood flow to the brain. It's temporary, but it can be a problem. Well, giraffes have a bigger problem because of the length of their legs. And they don't want their blood down there. They want their blood circulating like you would expect. And they accomplish this physiological feat by having a very, very tight skin on their legs and the connective tissue underneath that skin, which makes for them a natural G-suit, the kind of suit that jet pilots wear when they fly a jet plane that is pulling lots of gravities when it goes up or down. And those G-suits squeeze on the muscles of the pilot and squeeze the blood in the veins back up to the heart. And that's what the skin and fascial connections of the legs of a giraffe do for it. And finally, my last giraffe story, giraffes don't always stand around eating leaves. They also have to drink. So when they come to the water hole, like the one at the Alexander König Museum, they have to lower their head. And now their head is below their heart. And now the problem is the blood can flow in the veins the wrong way. And that would be very bad because it can cause a rupture of blood vessels in the brain. And if that happened, every water hole would be surrounded by dead giraffes, which of course is not the case. They have veins in their neck, and they have valves in those veins that prevents the flow of blood backwards to the brain. The blood can only flow towards the heart. So I talk about these and other stories from physiology, these physiological adaptations, as I work with both my own students, who of course are biology students, but also as I work with students in art and ecology. I've also, when I take my students to Germany, I end up teaching them German history. This is a photo from the Haus der Geschichte, the House of History, the Federal Museum of the History of Germany post-1945 in Bonn. And I take my students there. And here we're considering another aspect of architecture and materials. That is a diorama of the effects of a medium-sized atomic explosion in the center of Bonn. It would be, of course, horribly devastating. And I talked to my students about that as I discussed the changes in Germany post-World War II, the changes in Europe with the advent of the Cold War, and then, of course, the end of the Cold War. And what I'm trying to do here relates, though, to our overall theme. The students are going to live in Germany for 4 months. For the most part, they've never been there before. They don't speak German. They don't know much German history. They're living with German families, and they're not tourists. They're students. They're going to be there for a relatively long time. I want them to love it. And in order for them to love it, they have to understand it. And part of my goal and part of my job with my students when I take them abroad is to get them to a place where they want to understand so that they can love and appreciate the people, the places, the materials, the architecture, the things that they encounter in their time abroad, and then take that new knowledge back with them to Texas or wherever, and have it be an important component for them in their thinking about the world and the peoples of the world for the rest of their lives. I do teach physiology, of course, to pre-medical students and pre-veterinary medical students, and I teach history of medicine, so I talk a lot about Leonardo da Vinci. And here we're talking about the architecture of the body and the materials of the body. And let me give you a quick example that I do talk about with most of my students from the work of Da Vinci, who was, of course, a universal genius, and as well as a master of Renaissance painting. But he also did research and experiments on the way blood flows through the heart. He was very interested in cardiovascular physiology. And the picture at the bottom, the drawing, is a drawing in Da Vinci's sketchbooks of the way he envisioned the manner in which blood flows out of the heart and into the aorta, the great vessel that carries blood all over the body. It goes through a valve, the aortic valve, and Da Vinci believed that when the blood passed through that valve, it would form a vortex and then move forward. So the blood would flow through, form a vortex, and flow forward. And he argued that this was important because it would help close that valve. You want that valve to open when the heart contracts and pumps the blood. You don't want it to be open when the heart's relaxing because the blood will go the wrong way. So Da Vinci reasoned and did some examinations, not exactly experiments, but examinations of the hearts of oxen from a slaughterhouse that had been slaughtered. And he observed and felt that this must be the way that blood flows out of the heart and the way that the valves work, and that there are these vortices in the bloodstream in the aorta. And the colored pictures are of 4D functional magnetic resonance imaging from 2014, a study done with technology not available to Leonardo, showing you blood being ejected from the heart into the aorta, going from the top left over to the top right, and then continuing at the bottom, and you can see the vortices forming. And here, this bottom picture placed next to Da Vinci's drawing shows that eerie identicalness. So Da Vinci was actually absolutely right. It just took us 500 years to prove it. And this, again, is something I share with my students as examples, both of natural materials, of course, but also this understanding and love for the nature of the body. Then here are some of my pre-medical students enjoying a rest after watching surgeries at the unit clinic in Bonn. And then finally, and I'm about at the end of my section here before Jane comes back and we talk a bit about the communal projects we do at Gallery Pluto. My students in Germany also get to work with a biotech, with a couple of biotech companies. And one year we worked with Otto Bach, which is one of the premier builders of prosthetic limbs in the world. And they're based in Darmstadt. The Mutterfabrik is in Darmstadt. And my students were assigned a task one year. We developed a socket for transtibial amputees. That's an amputation below the knee. And they used the pieces of stuff we had lying around and that we accumulated, loose objects, to construct their models for this new sleeve that would go on the stump of the leg and would attach the person, the human material, to the prosthetic, the designed material. And so you can see some of the things my students play around with on the left, and a diagram of what the socket could be and the pressure points that they had to be wary of so that the sockets were comfortable. And these students were biomedical science students and bioengineers. And the engineers in particular didn't really appreciate the aesthetic component of this. And I was fortunate, Jane was with me in Germany that year, working with her students, and she graciously worked with mine and pointed out to them that the aesthetics were important in getting the patients, the people who are going to wear these devices, to love them, to understand and to love them, and to want to wear them. And it actually goes into the design of these things in real life at these companies. So this design project, and we've done others since, has been an integral part of what goes on with my students in these study abroad programs, and involves, of course, materials, and involves a melding of artificial materials to the natural materials of the human body, which is why we work in interdisciplinary teams. We have biomedical science students and biomedical engineering students working together, as is done at these companies in real life. And then finally, I also take advantage of the fact that I had some training in theater and opera, and I've developed a couple of personas that I lecture in from time to time, and one of them is a 17th century pest ox, the plague doctor, Dr. Schnabel, and here I am lecturing to my students in Vienna on our tour of the city, a medical history tour of the city. But here also, what I show the students are what would have been his materials, what would have been his early to mid-Renaissance medical materials. And I actually concoct some fake and safe medieval medicines, which I give my students throughout the course of the tour to protect them from the pest, from the plague. I don't give them anything bad, which in the Middle Ages and Renaissance would not have been the case. But here too, we have an example. The materials of science back then would have been manuscripts, incunabula, so early printed books, and of course would have been medicines, and also of course legends and folklore. And finally, at the end, teaching medical history at the Allgemeine Krankenhaus in Vienna with my students on the left, and then back to being in nature and teaching ecology on the right. So I'm going to ask Jane to come back. That was my narrative, which took me from New York City, from the Bronx to California. But now we're going to talk about our shared narrative. So on that side.
Sure.
And wrap things up with a couple of slides about Gallery Pluto.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. So the marriage of art and science. If you haven't figured it out by now, we're in love and we're married. So that's always a part of our story.
And we work to understand each other.
Yeah, hopefully.
All the time.
But what we wanted to do was actually bring this dialogue to those around us, to others, to set it up in a little more formal way. So we took our flat, our apartment, which is quite near the Rhine. We have a little view of the Rhine, if you look the right way, from our terrace in Bonn, and to create a domestic space where we could bring artists and scientists together to talk about those issues.
Yeah, our thinking really was to recreate a modern version of a 19th century, early 20th century salon, where there'd be these small exhibits, and there'd be music, and there'd be literature, and people from different backgrounds would come: scientists, philosophers, humanists, artists, of course, and talk about the way these disciplines come together and interact.
Right, to help understand each other. So here's Jeremy's letter. He's the director, and lots of us, not just me, but there's several of us, including Jörg, who are part of the Pluto team, and we help put things together, bring people together. And the last year, we've had a little trouble with the coronavirus because we've been stuck in the United States. But we've still been doing programming and programming online. I think if you show them the next image, sorry, my eye is watering. This is maybe you want to talk a little bit about healing spaces.
Yeah, we were able to do a online program in August of 2020, right? Yeah.
Yes.
In August of 2020, where we brought together two pairs of artists from different parts of the world, from Washington, D.C., Sense Sound, which is and from London, Healing Spaces, and those are the two couples on the upper pictures, upper right and upper left. So young artists who were working at the intersection of art and science, and medicine and science, in very interesting ways. In Sense Sound, the husband and wife team were trying to change the acoustic environment of emergency rooms, which are actually acoustically really terrible places. And Yoko Sen is a musician and had been a patient and realized that she needed to do something about that. And was doing some enormously creative work with altering the sounds, the beeping and the alarm signals, keeping them functional, but making them much more amenable to human life and healing. And then in Healing Spaces, these artists were working on the visual environment of psychiatric hospitals in the UK and changing them from what they mostly were pretty stark to being visual environments that also, again, were amenable to the healing and recovery of these patients who were suffering from psychiatric disorders. We brought them together for a presentation, but also for a dialogue between the two pairs. That I moderated, and that's me moderating in the middle there with my little headset on. And we had about 80 or so people tuning in.
It was great. I mean, I think what was important about that was they never would have met each other except for, bringing them together in this way. And I think it was very generative and creative for both of them to sort of just share what they were doing, not just with the audience and with us, but also with each other. And so that's really what we're trying to do, is bring people around for conversation, sometimes for great food, and often to talk about you know, how we're dealing with the challenges of our time, and how art and science can come together to hopefully address some of those challenges.
Exactly. So we come back in the end to our theme, our leitmotif from Baba Dioum.
So in the end, again, we'll conserve only what we love.
We will love only what we understand.
And we will understand only what we are taught.
Thanks for listening. We are happy now to engage with any and all of you
in conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There we go.
Thanks a lot, Jane and Jeremy, for the great presentation and sharing your kind of personal histories related to materials. I was wondering, are there directly questions from the audience? There was nothing in the chat so far. You could type it in there, or you could also just switch on your microphones and ask Jane and Jeremy directly. Nothing so far. Okay, there's one question. I will just read you that. I don't know if you can see it. What are your ideas on art or design industries that revolve around selling numerous physical copies in terms of sustainability and materials?
Very difficult. It's such a challenge. Once you start, here's the thing, once you start really understanding, right, you start seeing all the ways in which something you might not have paid attention to or known about previously could be doing harm, right, or could be causing problems in many ways. And so I think that we all wrestle with challenge in our various industries. And I think artists and designers, I mean, while we're problem solvers, we're also producers and makers, and we're producing and making often, you know, into a system that really doesn't need more. And so I'm not sure if that's exactly addressing your question, or if it's about, you know, more like mass production of art and design. Maybe we could clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, my take on it, and I'm not the artist in this marriage of art and science. You know, it can help an artist because it gets the artist's work out there, and it's good for people to have even reproductions of art in their environments, because I think it ties in to what we were talking about, that they get to know it, they get to understand it, then they love it, and then they appreciate it, and then they want a museum to be built, or they don't want art to be. But on the other hand, it's creating a superfluity of objects in a world that has too many objects, and that's becoming an existential problem for us. What do we do with all this stuff? And I know Jane has asked me or talked to me in the context of her own work, does the world need more things? And where will those things end up? If they end up on a rubbish tip someday, what have we, was that a wise thing to be making? And it's a difficult problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially for, those artists and designers and makers among us who maybe don't end up reaching some level of fame where people are, clamoring at our door and galleries, selling our work like hotcakes, and people are preserving and caring for those objects because they bought them and they have them and they want them. But often I have many people that I know are figuring out, what do I do now with all of these things I made? How do I share those things with others? And I do think that there's room to be a lot more innovative in how we distribute what we do have, whether it's a copy or whether it's an original piece of work that you make. And how you decide to share that. I mean, I think that's something that ends up being not just an economic choice, but a sort of choice of the heart too.
Well, another element there is, now we have the ability to digitize and share these things digitally without there being a physical object anymore. So one could make something, excuse me, could digitize it, could share it really easily with the world, destroy the original object, and recreate it, recycle it, reuse it. That's another
thought. Looks like there's some more questions coming in.
Yeah, I think it relates directly to what you just mentioned. To continue the topic of sustainability, would you consider using a non-fungible token as an alternative? However, for me, it's a pity that in order to preserve uniqueness of an artwork in the world of NFT, you have to destroy them in real life. What are your ideas on this?
Oh boy,
That's
I'm not sure we can.
Question, but
yeah, it's a great question.
It's a great question. I think we're going to leave that to the NFT scholars to think about.
Yeah.
It's really like, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I think we can maybe speak to the last part of that, to the destroying of the work. From my perspective, I don't like to see the physical work destroyed, but I think this is partly generational. My generation has come to live in the digital world like younger people because we have to, and I like it, and we make it work pretty well. And I'm a scientist, so the technology doesn't intimidate me overly, but there's a limit, I guess, maybe. And I'm still used to the physical object, the museum with the sculptures, with the paintings, and it's just not quite the same when all there is the digital memory, or the digital version.
I just think there's something about the physical world, where there's the sort of sensory experience of the object that is an inherent component of the object. And so we really move ourselves into a different place when we start moving away from that physicality. And instead what we really do, and I think those of you who are artists and architects and designers, you're doing that as you're creating spaces, right? So you end up moving away from some of that physical, tangible experience into a more spatial experience, or a more perceptual experience that is quite different from having that sort of physical contact. So,
and I would just add, from the perspective of sensory physiology, although this is changing with augmented reality and VR, mostly with digital, you have visual, you have auditory if there's sound associated with it, but no tactile, and at least not yet, or not easily out there. And while they don't let you go up and handle the sculptures in museums, if you own one, you certainly can. And it's important, I think, for human beings to be getting information in from all of those senses if possible, because that's what allows your brain to form sort of a complete picture of the object. And so I think there's still some limitations. And even in terms of money, I mean, we're using real money less and less because we're using credit cards and paying through the banks with improvising it and so on and so forth. But it's still, there's still something about an actual bill as opposed to a Bitcoin, which to my best of my knowledge has no physical existence. You can't have it in your hand, I don't think. You can just have it on your hard drive. But then there was a story of the guy who lost his password, and he had like $1 billion worth of Bitcoin on a hard drive he couldn't access. So I don't know if that was true or not, but that's what I heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered the question. I wasn't sure what, Victoria, what you meant that works will get destroyed for the NFT, but because sometimes I think it just exists completely as a digital thing, and maybe sometimes there's an object behind it, but that doesn't have to be the case at all.
Here's something I could add to that, Jörg, which is out of a conversation that I had with a conservator one time, who was a very expert in making gold leaf, in applying gold leaf and teaching that technique. And I thought it was so interesting. I asked him, is this something we're still going to be doing, and why is that valuable, and how should I think about that? And he said, you know, it may be less, like obviously we're not doing that so much anymore, but some of these historical techniques will become more precious with time, simply because we're doing something else. And so I do think it's interesting when you're making those aesthetic choices for yourself in terms of what you're going to make, to think about, to think about both historical ways of making and new ways of making, and making choices that make sense for you, because it's just as hard to find someone to appreciate your digital work as your manifest work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have a short question maybe that can be, so about how toxic materials for art are. So what are like really or the most toxic material maybe you used or you can use at all in art? And what are the least toxic materials you might know or you encountered?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what kind of artist you are. If you're a painter, I mean, I think the thing to be wary of is when we first, like in my generation, when we shifted to oil paint, which is what you saw all over my smock in that picture, to acrylic painting, we thought we were getting rid of the toxic solvents and materials of oil. And we went to acrylic, and it turns out that, much of what my generation was using in terms of acrylic paint were incredibly problematic for the land and the water, and they weren't really good choices, even in terms of toxicity, for ourselves, and certainly not for the landscape. So I do think it just needs to be part of whatever you're doing, to really do your research. That's your responsibility. And there's with the internet, I mean, it used to be difficult to understand chemistry if you weren't a chemist, and now you can. You really can with the internet. There's and also there's so many more requirements legally that ask materials companies to report on their chemistry.
Yeah, but it's a two-pronged problem. It's the problem of toxicity for the user, for the artist, and then it's toxicity for the environment when you throw out the parts you're throwing out, the rags, the empty paint tubes, the brushes, and so on. And I think up until fairly recently, the makers of those materials were optimizing for the artist, not for the artist's health, but for optimizing for the art, maybe is the better way to say it. They were giving you a pigment and a solvent that would work for your production, and they weren't really thinking that much about long-term effects. And what we're learning, from biomedical research over the decades, is that in many instances there are some very long-term effects, things that don't crop up for decades after exposure, things like cancer, things like respiratory diseases, that's.
Yeah, and even just simple things you can sometimes switch. Like, for example, we always just grew up rinsing our brushes with soap and water and letting things, feeling like we took care of it. It went down the sink, and and they take care of that at the treatment plant. But more and more we're finding that sometimes, for example, putting your brush in water and pouring it into a plaster where the solids become letting the solids be absorbed by the plaster and throwing that away as a solid rather than as a liquid is better for the environment. But that's something that you just need to make a commitment to keep up on, and hopefully your friends also sort of share that information, because they might be more aware than, certainly this was true in my generation. I feel like my friends were sometimes more aware of those issues and of solving and resolving those issues than some of the teachers that we were working with at the time.
Okay, yeah, and there's another quite interesting question, I think. So it's Julia Schwartz is asking, I believe that most people throw a lot of objects in the trash that are still salvageable. Do you think there's a way that we can change that mindset, that we try to fix or remake that object into something new instead of getting rid of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm wondering if in Germany they have these buy nothing groups. Do you have this?
You mean where you can swap or secondhand?
Yeah, we have is now. It kind of cropped up here during the pandemic, that neighborhoods started creating these, like, I guess it's on Facebook, but these online groups. I belong to one called the Buy Nothing. And the point is that even if you have like, oh, I have extra cardboard boxes or packing materials, or I just made 2 apple pies and I can't possibly eat the second, or I have extra fruit from my tree, or you can also ask for things like, oh, I need, I've gotten some of my best art materials recently from those Buy Nothing groups where someone was getting rid of something that was perfect for what I was looking for. And so it was a great way of not only just swapping your stuff and keeping it out of the landfill here, but also getting to know your neighbors and forming community. And I think especially in the neighborhood we live in, there's a lot of young families who are, whose kids are outgrowing their clothes and toys and things like that. And they're constantly swapping these things. And it seems like a good system.
Yeah, I think, fundamentally, one way with human beings is to make throwing the stuff away more expensive than keeping it. What we especially in the United States, certainly, and to some extent, I think in Germany, food is relatively inexpensive, clothing is relatively inexpensive. So we don't darn our socks, or we don't darn our house dresses like in Jane's piece much anymore. And even the skills on how to do that are kind of lost or not valued. And so it is cheaper and more convenient and seemingly better to throw things out and replace them with a batch of new things. But if that process became prohibitively expensive to do, people would do less of it. It's I think a tricky thing with human nature and the way modern humans think about things. We've become accustomed to cheap materials, and cheap materials are ones that it's easy to sort of psychologically throw away and replace. But expensive materials, that would not be the case.
Yeah. Maybe I also have a small question related to that, because Jane, you showed, not talking about toxicity of materials. I was also wondering the contrast between working with your generic paint material versus working with all these found objects, because you mentioned you created a whole archive of these objects with certain orders and things like that. And I was wondering, how does your creative process or your conception works with these found objects? Because it's a very different thing if you're working with a blank canvas, or when you're working with this rich, you said, I think, treasure of materials. Maybe both of you, could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's actually, it's something that I just love doing. And as I said, organizing it, and I have these sort of, set of boxes where things are labeled in a certain way, or I can archive them. And, sometimes when I'm working, I know I'm looking for a fabric item or a small item or a wooden spoon or something like that. Like I have a whole box of just wooden spoons, the kind you would use for cooking, but a lot of them have been burned or worn, or, and those sometimes I'm just looking for a shape. Sometimes I'm looking for something that I can manipulate in a certain way or attach in a certain way. So one of the things in working like that and just playing in those boxes is starting to learn how things go together, right? So how you attach one thing to the next in a really nice way is always a challenge. And something that I've started really understanding as an integral part of that manner of working. So it's like finding the objects or playing with the objects. And there's a kind of loose parts theory that they develop for children, actually, that you want to give them open-ended objects to play with, things that don't have a prescribed function or meaning, at least in the mind of the child, so that they feel free to create. And a lot of that creating is about putting things together, right? So it's sort of going even back to Picasso, handlebars and bicycle seat to make a bull's head. And you start sort of seeing things or imagining things in that kind of play. And then the real artistry of it really comes in sort of crafting those connections between objects, right? Because those materials have a certain kind of property to them. So there's things that are soft, there's things that are already, you know, unflexible, and like how do you end up kind of joining or marrying those parts together is a big part of my work, and it's a part of the joy of making the work too. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, Jörg.
Yeah, definitely. And I was just wondering if there's a similar process in science where you can, or if.
Yeah, I mean, I know I was thinking about it in the context of Jane's answer. I mean, certainly we don't really start with a blank slate. I guess I don't think there's ever really a point in science where you're looking at a blank page and you're projecting ideas and concepts onto it. You're always looking at what is already known, excuse me, what is already believed about how a system works, and then developing your hypothesis from that. With my bioengineering students, you know, one of the things that we have to sort of break the habit of them thinking that there already is an answer for something. And this is a little tangential to your question, but my engineering students will come to me when we give them these assignments, which are real world assignments of problems given to us by real companies that don't have a solution yet. And my students say, well, you and the engineers of the company, you know the answer and you're just not telling us. And I always say, well, no, that's not true. If we had an answer, we wouldn't be doing this. So you have to put the parts together in a unique way. And you have to, either use found materials conceptually, the way Picasso used bicycle pieces to create a representation of a bull. It's challenging for students in the sciences because of the way we train them from early on. We train them from early on in the misconception that there is this huge gap between the humanities, the fine arts, and the sciences. That in the sciences, we know stuff. And in the arts and humanities, you feel stuff. And that is a dichotomy that is untrue. And I think it gets in the way. So that was a sort of quasi-metaphysical answer to your question, but it's the best I could do.
Well, I mean, I think it makes sense because when I'm working with Jeremy's students, for example, we often bring in boxes of loose parts, right? Because they're trying to conceptualize, for example, in the Autobot project, they're trying to conceptualize what this device that's this transtibial for amputees, what this device should be like and how it should function, but also what it should look like and how it should fit. And they're trying to do this by first drawing, which they usually don't have much skill with, or somehow using some program on the computer, which really aren't as sophisticated as your brain in that kind of problem solving yet. There was a lot of idea generating that happened when we gave them these loose parts, things like toilet paper rolls and bits and pieces of things, like Jeremy was showing, where they could try that out. And also I did a lot of work with them thinking about, like, as an Alexander technique teacher, thinking like, how does it feel when you stand? Where is your weight? What happens when you go to step off the curb? Like, for somebody who has a prosthetic limb, that is a very different experience than for those of us who have two functioning legs. And so understanding that and thinking about, how weight shift happens and how it was all experiential, right? And playful, at least at the beginning. And it needed to be. Yeah, they were sort of wanting to skip ahead.
Yeah. And if I could riff on that, getting them to use their own bodies as a model, both in terms of thinking about how they locomote, like Jane was saying, but also to say, look at your lower leg and bend your knee and hold your ankle and pretend you don't have a leg below your knee. How does that feel? What would you want to be there if you couldn't have your natural leg? And what would you want it to look like? And how would you want it to function? And it was actually a really interesting exercise, I think, for us as educators to work through that with the students. The biology students on the teams had different problems. They were intimidated by the engineering aspects. They were intimidated by the fact that it was a device. And they said, well, I don't build devices, I'm a biologist. I said, you don't understand. You're building a device that attaches to the human device. And your field is the human machine, even though, of course, much more complicated than any machine. And so that was sort of the challenges of that.
Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, I think if there are no more questions, we can wrap it up with that. I have to make a quick announcement for the next talk, which will happen next week. And we will hear Thomas Auer from Trans Solar Climate Engineering, Klima Engineering. And the title of his talk will be High Tech, Low Tech, Robust. So yeah, and it will be moderated by my colleague from the Interior Design Department, Professor Dirk Miguel Schlupkotten. So yeah, please join in again next week. And yeah, I want to say thanks a lot again, Jane and Jeremy, that you spent your morning giving a presentation to us. And I really hope that you will soon be able to travel to Germany again and to catch up with you in person. And yeah, maybe you might also come once to Trier in person to give like a little seminar or another talk here. I would be great if you could do that.
Yeah, we'd love that, Jörg, and we also just want to invite everyone to tune in to Gallery Pluto. Follow us on Instagram. We've got some exciting programming that will be coming in person in the summer.
In Bonn.
Okay. Cool.
Not too far away.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye everybody. Have a nice evening and stay safe, and maybe see you next week in the next lecture.
Tschüss zusammen.
Tschüss.
Bye everyone.
Tschüss.
Tschüss.